Okay, so welcome to day 3. We're going to get rolling. It's a huge pleasure to introduce Mark Solms, meeting him for the first time in person. He's from the Neuroscience Institute of the University of Capetown. He has a really amazing book called The Hidden Spring and some others. But please, go for it.
Thanks very much, Mark. Great to be here. I'm going to reverse the narrative flow or narrative direction that Carl deployed yesterday. He went from formalisms to biology. I'm going to go from biology to formalisms, not because I'm trying to be contrary, but because the biological argument, I think what I have observed, that despite what seems to me to be overwhelming evidence, I've provoked a great deal of resistance from my biological colleagues, from my neuroscientific colleagues. So I want to spend as much time as I can on setting out the biological argument, and hopefully I'll be able to convince a handful of new people today. So here we have, paraphrasing Nagel, here we have the hard problem of consciousness. Why and how is there something it is like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? Now, Chalmers famously claims that it's not possible for us to answer this question in the usual, using the usual tools of cognitive neuroscience, namely explaining the function. He says, oh, I've lost my pointer. Sorry, let me just, well, I'll use that. At the end of this long quotation, he says, there's no cognitive function such as that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. And he references Frank Jackson's knowledge argument in this respect. You can know everything that there is to know about the functional mechanisms of vision. It will not prepare you for what it is like to see. It won't explain what it is like to see. It won't predict that there is something it is like to see. I think Chalmers's argument is not unreasonable, given all of the evidence summarized, for example, in this review paper, the title of which says it all. There's perception without awareness of what is perceived. There's learning without awareness of what is learnt. What this points to is the fact that things like visual perception can go on in the dark. There is no reason why there should be something it is like to see. Seeing doesn't seem to require experience. You can recognize faces unconsciously. You can read with comprehension unconsciously, and so on. These are, and you will be influenced by those experiences, or not, shouldn't call them experiences. You'll be influenced by those visual information processings. In other words, you will learn from what you've recognized facially and understood linguistically. So these are obviously cortical functions, face recognition, reading. In fact, these are uniquely human cortical functions. And so it's perfectly reasonable to ask, why does there have to be something it is like to recognize a face or to read a word with comprehension if you can do it unconsciously? So again, with reference to Jackson's knowledge argument, it does seem as if a specification of the functional mechanism of visual perception doesn't tell us anything about what it is like to see and why there is anything like seeing. Now, the nub of my argument, and as I said, this is the part I'm going to spend most of my time on, is that the reason that we have struck this rock is because we have been focusing on cortical functions. And cortical functions, as I'm going to argue, are not intrinsically conscious. The cortex can do most of its cognitive gymnastics without consciousness. And I'm going to argue that we should rather have focused our attention on the brainstem and in particular on the reticular activating system. I think that this enables us to take a different approach to this question of the relationship between functional mechanism and experience. Now, of course, the fundamental role that the reticular activating system plays in the generation of consciousness, we've known about this since 1949. It was in 1949 that Magoon and Maruzzi showed in cats, and since then it's been abundantly demonstrated to apply also to human beings and indeed to all vertebrates, that lesions of the reticular activating system produce coma, and disconnection of the reticular activating system from the cortex, in other words, severing the ascending axons from the reticular activating system to thalamus and cortex, obliterates all the conscious functions of the cortex. What this shows us is that cortical consciousness is entirely dependent upon brainstem arousal. This is not controversial. So you might think, well, that's the end of my talk. This is not controversial. The evidence is incontrovertible. So end of story. But it's not the end of the story. Oh, sorry, before I tell you why it's not the end of the story, let me point out this astonishing fact that the smallest lesion site that is capable of obliterating consciousness, that is to say, producing coma in human beings, is 2 cubic millimeters in extent, the size of a match head. There's a coma-specific region in the parabrachial complex, 2 cubic millimeters in extent, and lesions there reliably obliterate consciousness in human beings. So that gives you a sense of how concentrated is the consciousness generating powers of these deep brainstem nuclei. So as I said, why doesn't that settle the question? The reason it doesn't settle the question is because the way in which Magoon and Maruzzi conceptualized their findings is as follows. And they did this evidently in order to preserve our long-standing belief that the cortex is the seat of consciousness. They drew a distinction between 2 types of consciousness, namely the contents or qualities of consciousness, which they claimed, they continued to claim, is what's contributed by the cortex. And what the reticular activating system contributes is merely a level of consciousness, a background quantitative sort of prerequisite for the cortex to do its properly phenomenally conscious thing. So on this argument, the brainstem provides something like a power supply to a television set. Your television set can't do its televisual thing, can't transmit and display televisual content and quality unless the television set is plugged in at the wall. But this doesn't mean that the electrical socket or the power supply derived from it is the real source of televisual content. I'm not spinning it. I mean, this is basically the argument that the brainstem doesn't provide qualitative, phenomenal, conscious content. It's just a necessary precondition for the cortex to be able to do its consciousness generating thing. Now, it's this that I'm wanting to spend time demonstrating is incorrect. It's not true. And as I said, I've had a surprising degree of resistance to this argument, and that's why I'm going to dwell on it a little bit. So, exhibit 1 for my argument. If the cortex was responsible for conscious contents and qualities, and that all that the brainstem provides is a sort of autonomic wakefulness, a background blank screen, then the prediction that arises from that is that human beings who have no cortex should have no phenomenal consciousness. They should display blank wakefulness, but there should be no content and no quality. There should not be something it is like to be such a child. So here on the screen, you have an MRI scan of such a child. She has no cortex. And this is just one example. She's not exceptional. What you would predict from Magoon and Maruzzi's theory, which has become the mainstream theory, which remains the mainstream theory, is that this child should display blank wakefulness. In fact, in neurology, we call this state the vegetative state, which is defined as non-responsive wakefulness. So this is what you should expect. The child should have a sleep-waking cycle, but no phenomenal consciousness at all. So let's have a look at this child. Here she is. This is her. As you can see, she's awake. She goes to sleep at night. She wakes up in the morning. But much more interesting is what happens when her baby brother is placed on her lap. She responds. Remember the definition of the vegetative state, non-responsive wakefulness. Well, she responds. And she responds affectively. She responds emotionally. When her brother's placed on her lap, she goes, oh, she likes it. And as I said earlier, she's by no means exceptional. This is the rule with these children. No cortex, and yet they're conscious. And their consciousness does have a content, and it does have a quality. It has affective content and affective quality. The emotional responses that I'm speaking of, it's important to add, are situationally appropriate. That given the context, if you clap your hands, the child gets a fright. If you tickle her, she giggles. If you remove her brother from her lap, she protests, and so on. So they show a wide range of basic emotional and bodily affective states, and they show them in appropriate ways at appropriate times. They show the full range of these basic emotional and basic bodily affective states. Now, there are two problems that we're left with. The one is why does she respond? If she's got no cortex, why does she respond to her brother being placed on her lap? How come she has any knowledge of her brother being placed on her lap? So since this is a common cause of puzzlement, let me just quickly explain something of the functional anatomy. Here I'm using the visual sense as my example, but the same applies to somatic sensation and gustation and hearing. So I'm just using this one to illustrate the point that from the eye, the optic nerve projects to the lateral geniculate body and from there to the occipital cortex. But that's not its only destination. It projects also to the superior colliculi in the brainstem. So this child has an intact brain stem, intact superior colliculi. So she is receiving visual, auditory, somatosensory, and gustatory information. It's just that the information is processed unconsciously. Immediately anterior to the superior colliculi is the periaqueductal gray, the PAG, and the affective response is generated from there. So she's responding affectively. In other words, she has the phenomenal quality and content of affective experience, but she doesn't know what that experience is about. She has no images, no conscious images as to what it is that evoked this feeling. She just has the raw feeling. The other thing that we're left with, and this comes to the heart of the matter of my colleagues' reluctance to accept this evidence, is that they say, well, how do you know that there is something it is like to be that child? How do you know that these are not merely reflexive responses? How do we know she's not a philosophical zombie? I have to mention that these arguments come from colleagues who've spent no time with these children. It's really anybody who's actually spent some time interacting with these children finds it very hard to believe that there's nothing it's like to be such a child. But of course, that is by no means conclusive evidence. And so we need to rely upon other lines of evidence. And that's what I want to set out for you now. Exhibit 2. What would you think if the brain stem was actually producing raw feelings? What would you think would happen if you stimulate reticular activating nuclei? On Magoon and Maruzzi's theory, on the mainstream theory, it should lead to fluctuations in the level of consciousness. In other words, you should make the child more awake or less awake, but it shouldn't do anything to their phenomenal consciousness. It shouldn't have any consequences for the contents and the qualities of what it is like to be them, if there's anything it's like to be them at all. So here I'm using an example Again, just one illustrative example to show you what happens if you stimulate these reticular activating system nuclei. On the alternative theory, not the Magoon and Maruzzi one, but my one, saying that those children's brain stems, their intact brain stems, are generating affective states of mind. The prediction from that theory is that if you stimulate these nuclei, you should produce artificially intense affective states of mind. So here's what happens if you stimulate. This is the substantia nigra, which is, of course, part of the reticular activating system. And an electrode was placed in this woman's brain. She has Parkinson's disease, but no psychiatric history. And no psychiatric diagnosis at any point in her lifetime, and in particular, no diagnosis of depression. The electrode, which was aimed at the subthalamic nucleus, went a couple of millimeters too deep, and it went into this part of the reticular activating system, and this is what happened. The patient expressed profound sadness within 5 seconds. Although still alert, she started to cry and communicated feelings of sadness, guilt, uselessness, and hopelessness. She says, "I'm falling down in my head. I no longer wish to live, to see anything, hear anything, feel anything." When asked why she was crying and if she felt pain, she responded, "No, I'm fed up with life. I've had enough. I don't want to live anymore. I'm disgusted with life. Everything's useless, always feeling worthless." When asked why she was sad, she replied, "I'm crying over myself, of course. I'm hopeless. Why am I bothering you?" This depression, which, as I said, was, and it can be called nothing other than depression. I mean, in fact, suicidal depression in somebody who's never experienced anything like it in her life. This depression disappeared less than 90 seconds after stimulation was stopped. This patient very generously allowed the surgeon to do a double-blind trial after this, to see whether he could reliably produce this state by stimulating the substantia nigra as opposed to stimulating the intended site of the target of the electrode, which was the subthalamic nucleus, which is not part of the reticular activating system. And every time he stimulated the substantia nigra, he brought about this intense affective response again. I say, as I've said already, I say again, this is not a unique case. This is what we observe. If you stimulate reticular activating system nuclei whenever you have the opportunity to do so clinically, and we have many opportunities also to stimulate the periaqueductal gray, which I mentioned earlier. When you stimulate these structures, you trigger the most intense affective states anywhere. There's nowhere else in the brain that you generate such intense affective states, and also the widest range of affective states. So this is what we reliably observe when we stimulate those structures. You don't get intense affects at all when you stimulate cortex. So this, I say, is evidence against the view that those children with brain stems alone, that they were not feeling anything. Here we have evidence, positive evidence, that stimulating those structures produces the predicted feelings. Now, another method, positron emission tomography. Here, what you would predict if the brain stem is where feelings are coming from, you would predict that if you image the brain, when the research participants are in intense affective states, that the site of brain activation that correlates with those intense affective states would not be cortical, but rather subcortical, and in particular in the brain stem. And that's exactly what you observe. Here are PET images of people in intense states of sadness, anger, happiness, and fear. And as you can see, the activation is brainstem, 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 and fibers arising from the brainstem, and likewise here, in sharp contrast to the cortex. A fourth line of evidence, and I'll stop there, pharmacological manipulations. It's something that I think we don't sufficiently take note of, that if you manipulate these neuromodulators, that are sourced in the reticular activating system, what you produce is changes in affect. So famously, serotonin, the availability of serotonin is increased by SSRIs, by antidepressants. Dopamine is blocked in antipsychotics. Noradrenaline, if reduced, reduces anxiety. So drugs that are the mainstay of contemporary psychopharmacology, drugs that are used to treat emotional and mood states, these neuromodulators are sourced in the reticular activating system. If the reticular activating system were the source only of blank wakefulness, then you might expect anesthetists to be very interested in this part of the brain. But here we're talking about psychiatrists. In all of these lines of evidence, the hydranencephalic children with no cortex, think about that, the sharp contrast between what you saw there, no cortex at all, and yet the child shows emotional and other affective responses. Contrast that with what happens if you lesion the reticular activating system. Just 2 cubic millimeters compared to the whole expanse of the cortex is enough to obliterate consciousness entirely. But as my colleagues say, we don't know whether these children feel like anything because they've got no cortex. They can't tell us what they feel. So we stimulate those brainstem structures in people who do have intact cortex, and they tell us it produces intense affective states. We image people in intense affective states, and we find that the activation is in the brainstem. And when we want to manipulate affective states pharmacologically, what we manipulate is neuromodulators sourced in the reticular activating system. So all of this, I think, is extremely weighty evidence for the view that the brainstem does not just produce blank wakefulness. It does not only produce a level or a quantity of a prerequisite power. It does produce a quality of consciousness, a content of consciousness, and that quality and content is affective. Now, remember what I said earlier. I said that it is not controversial that the reticular activating system is prerequisite for cortical consciousness, that the cortex cannot generate consciousness by itself. It must be, in inverted commas, powered up by the reticular activating system. If you add to that the observations that I've just been showing you, namely that the reticular activating system doesn't produce just a level of consciousness, but rather produces qualitative content of affect, then what we have to conclude, and I'm going to pause for a second for emphasis, what we have to conclude is that affect is prerequisite for all other forms of consciousness, that the cognitive and perceptual, the conscious cognitive and perceptual functions of cortex are contingent upon affect. First, you need affect. In the beginning was the affect. I've mentioned neuromodulation here, so let me just quickly show you this slide. Synaptic activity, neurotransmission, or signal states, is modulated by postsynaptic gain, that is to say, neuromodulation as opposed to neurotransmission, signal precisions as opposed to signal states. And this determines synaptic efficiency, that is neuroplasticity or signal parameters over time. So just bear this in mind. So much of what we do in cognitive neuroscience focuses on the first and the third of these things. The contribution of the reticular activating system. And by the way, it's not only the reticular activating system. There are other arousal structures too. But I'm focusing on the central one. So the relationship between brainstem or core brainstem structures and cortex is something like this. Cortex is responsible for neurotransmission, neuroplasticity, all of this, this perceptual signaling and this cognitive learning on the basis of this perceptual signaling is modulated by the reticular activating system. And this modulation seems to coincide with affect. Okay, now I move on. The discoverer of the unconscious, 100 years before, or rather 80 or 90 years before the cognitive unconscious was rediscovered by cognitive scientists and cognitive neuroscientists, the discoverer, Freud, the person who had who was most invested in the idea that many, if not most, mental functions can carry on in the dark, wrote the following, and he didn't write this once, he wrote this millions of times. It's surely of the essence of an emotion that we should be aware of it. That is, that it should become known to consciousness. Thus, the possibility of the attribute of unconsciousness would be completely excluded as far as emotions, feelings, and affects are concerned. I know that some people speak of unconscious emotions and unconscious affects. And there's a lot to be said about that. It's mainly definitional. Some of it's methodological. If anyone's interested in that, we can go into it in the Q&A. But I've emphasized the word feelings in order to make clear what I'm talking about. I'm talking about feelings that you can't have if you don't feel them. A feeling is not a feeling if you don't feel it. An unconscious feeling is an oxymoron. So that's what I'm talking about. I'm saying this thing that we call feeling, a raw feeling, is what is generated by the core brainstem structures in question. And these are intrinsically conscious states. Please note, it's not just a linguistic or a semantic point that I'm making. It is a semantic point. I'm talking about a thing called feeling, and you have to feel it, otherwise you don't have this thing that I'm talking about. But more importantly, I want to remind you about the evidence that I've just presented to you, namely that these structures, which are the most concentrated consciousness-producing structures in the brain, that is their function. Unlike the cortex, which does all these other things, which I told you earlier, it can do unconsciously, these perceptual and cognitive things. They are not intrinsically conscious. They can go on unconsciously. The whole point of the reticular activating system is to activate. Its function is to produce consciousness. And so I'm saying we should be looking there. This is where we should be looking if we're wanting to understand the functional mechanism of consciousness. You're never going to find the functional mechanism of consciousness by looking to a part of the brain that is not intrinsically conscious. You're never going to understand its mechanism when you look at functions which are not intrinsically conscious. I'm saying that the function of this part of the brain is intrinsically conscious. It's the whole point. So back to Chalmers. I read you this earlier. Chalmers said there's no cognitive function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience. That's the nub of his argument. That's the very basis of the hard problem of consciousness. And I've emphasized now the word cognitive, because if you replace it with the word affective, you have a very different state of affairs. If Chalmers were to claim there is no affective function such that we can say in advance that explanation of that function will automatically explain experience, then what he's saying is incoherent. Because the function of feeling, I think we can say in advance that to explain the function of feeling will automatically explain experience, because feelings have to be felt. This is why I'm saying we've been looking in the wrong place. And the whole problem changes if we look down into the brainstem and look at affect, at feeling, rather than at perception and cognition. So pause, and I move on. Now, what is the functional mechanism of feeling? Because I'm saying that if we can explain the functional mechanism of feeling, then we will explain experience. The very thing that Chalmers says is not possible. So the functional mechanism of affect or feeling is homeostatic. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the mechanism of homeostasis, so I'm not going to belabor the point. We living things, and when I say we living things, I mean all living things, we function homeostatically. We have viable bounds, we have phenotypic viable bounds, and we have to remain within those viable bounds. If we move too far out of those expected states or preferred states, then we die. That's the function of homeostasis, is to make sure that we stay within our viable bounds. So a deviation away from those bounds in this diagram is indicated by the red arrow. It's making a demand on the organism to do something, a demand for work. The organism has to do something to return to homeostasis, otherwise it will die. The blue arrow is the doing something. It returns the creature to homeostasis. In fact, I shouldn't say creature, I should say organism, because this doesn't apply only to animal life. And what is required is a prediction. In other words, what must I do in order to return myself to my viable bounds? And in simple organisms, those predictions are provided by reflex, or in more complex organisms by what we call instinct. These are innate predictions. When I move out of homeostasis, I release this reflex, and that returns me to homeostasis. So there's no need for feeling here. Feeling is an extended form. Affect depends upon an extended form of homeostasis, which works like this. When we move out of our viable bounds, we feel an unpleasant feeling. This tells the organism now registers subjectively, something is going badly for me. And conversely, when it's moving back towards its viable bounds, it feels a pleasurable feeling. This subjective state of mind tells the organism that things are going better for me. Carry on doing this, as opposed to don't go there, don't do that. This is bad for you, this predicts your demise, as opposed to carry on doing this, this is good for you, this is going to return you to homeostasis. The functional advantage of this evolutionary adaptation is that it enables the organism to survive in uncertain environments. Remember what I said earlier, we have innate predictions provided by natural selection, that if you find yourself moving out of homeostasis in regard to a particular need of your phenotype, then all you do is release the relevant reflex and it returns you to your viable bounds. But what if you're in an unpredicted situation, in a situation that is not commensurate with that reflex, where that reflex doesn't cut it? Then what happens is you die. A small subset of the population will survive because it happens to have the right polymorphism, and then their progeny will reproduce that new response to this previously unexpected environment. But if you have feeling, then you're able to make choices. This is an absolutely fundamental point. The animal is not doomed to the vagaries of natural selection that I mentioned earlier. Rather, in its own lifetime, it can decide, this is going badly for me, let me change my mind, let me change tack, let me do something else until it feels better. And then I'll do that. And what is more, I'll learn from the experience. So voluntary action becomes possible. Voluntary action is not a small thing. It's an enormously valuable evolutionary adaptation. And all that it depends upon is the organism being able to register its own states subjectively. I could give an example, but I don't want to waste time. The example I normally use is somebody being in a carbon dioxide-filled room. They've never been in a burning building before, don't know what to do. It's a completely unpredicted situation. And so they feel their way through the problem. If they go the wrong way, their air hunger gets worse, it feels worse. If they go the right way, their respiratory distress decreases, it feels better. And so they go the right way and learn from the experience. That's the kind of thing that we can do by dint of feeling. That's what feeling is for. It enables us to navigate uncertain situations, to make choices. Choices must be underwritten by a value system. There must be something that's better or worse. Otherwise, how can you make a choice? And that value system is the value system that underpins all life forms, namely that it is good to survive, bad to die, and that these values are felt as pleasures and unpleasures. Now, a subtle but important point is indicated at the bottom of the slide, where I say that this applies across multiple categorical variables. Organisms don't have only one need, they have multiple needs, and those needs are categorically distinctive from each other. And you can't reduce them to a common denominator. So you can't say, I have 8 out of 10 of sleepiness, and 3 out of 10 of thirst. Therefore, I've got 11 out of 20 of total need. So all I'll do is sleep. And thereby, I'll reduce the common currency of need. It doesn't work like that. You have to sleep and you have to drink, otherwise you'll die. And why I'm emphasizing this so much is because categorical variables are qualitatively distinguished from each other. So what I'm pointing to is a mechanism here. Let me just plod through it to make sure that I'm making my point clearly. It is the organism is registering its own state. So this is intrinsically subjective. It's only registering its own state. That's what generates affects. And this state is intrinsically valenced. It just is bad if its need is increasing. It's bad if its need is increasing. It's good if its need is decreasing, but it's only good or bad for the organism. It's not good or bad in and of itself. It's only good or bad for the organism because it's the organism's viability. It's my viability that's at issue. And then what is more, this is not just registered on some continuous variable of valence, but rather it's registered, necessarily must be registered within qualitatively distinctive categories. So I'm saying that an organism that is equipped with this mechanism just does have subjective states which matter to the organism and which are intrinsically qualitative. That is just an affect. That is a feeling. And I think that answers this question. Why and how is there something it's like to be an organism, something it's like for the organism? Well, I've just explained why and how. Now, in the last few minutes allotted to me, let me go to the formalisms. This is a slide that you saw yesterday, that Carl showed you yesterday. And I'm not going to go through it all again for that reason, but I just want to point out that this mechanism is this mechanism of self-organization of the kind that Carl was talking about, is the mechanism that underwrites homeostasis. Here you have a homeostat. Here you have its control center. Here you have its receptors, and here you have its effectors. So there's a control center, which is the generative model, and on the basis of the generative model of the outside world, the organism acts on its environment in ways that its generative model leads it to expect, will bring it back into its viable bounds, back into the sensory states that it requires to be, because let us not forget, of course, sensory states are not only extraceptive states, they're interoceptive states too. And so that is a homeostatic mechanism, relying upon predictions generated by the predictive model. When I read this paper of Carl's in 2013, I was absolutely blown away because if you can reduce the mechanism of homeostasis to a mathematical formalism, and if affect feeling is an extended form of homeostasis, then you should be able to reduce the functional mechanism of feeling to a formalism too. And so that's what we did in this paper, this 2018 paper. You'll see this is the same basic arrangement as I showed you a moment ago. But what's added here, which Carl didn't speak about yesterday, is the role of precision. Remember my earlier slide where I said synaptic gain, as we describe it physiologically, postsynaptic gain is the same thing as precision modulation. So the role of the brainstem, the role of the reticular activating system and these other neuromodulatory arousal systems is precision modulation. So it basically works like this. Here is the generative model, the model of the outside world, on the basis of predictions of what sensory states will flow from its actions, the organism acts on its environment and then compares the sensory states that it actually receives with the sensory states that were predicted on the basis of the model, and it computes an error quantity. And the role of precision modulation is modulating confidence. And I love the word confidence. Of course, it's a statistical term, but it is also a subjective term. It is the confidence of the organism in its policy. Is what I'm doing working or not? And as its confidence in the error signal increases, so its confidence in its action policy decreases. To put it pithily, and here I'm quoting something that Carl said, if things are turning out as expected, that's good. And if uncertainty prevails, that's bad. And so there you have the role of affect, the role of precision modulation. These are the two equations that versions of which Cole showed you yesterday. Here's the third one, which highlights the role of precision modulation. It just says that the rate of change of precision over time depends on how much free energy changes when you change precision. This means that precision will look as if it's trying to minimize free energy. The rate of this free energy minimization process is the difference between the variance, that is the inverse precision, and the sum of squared prediction errors. Please note that the notation that we've used here is different from the conventional notation, and that's just because we were nodding. I asked Carl, could we nod our hats to Freud, who has the great distinction of at least trying to bring subjectivity into mental science, and this is the notation that he used. So I'm coming to the end. I've got 2 minutes to go. So I believe that there we have, at least in broad outline, in a sort of cartoon form, we have the mechanism, the functional mechanism whereby affect is generated. This little statement on the blackboard of Richard Feynman was found on his blackboard upon his death, says, "What I cannot create, I do not understand." So if this mechanism really is the causal mechanism whereby feelings are generated, then we should be able to engineer an artificial agent which has artificial feelings. And that's what we're busy trying to do now. And we're using the POMDP formalism. And in fact, we've just extended it slightly recently, and I've just highlighted there the role of expected precisions and expected free energies. This is the basic mechanism that our artificial agent is using. I want to emphasize that what we're doing here it coincides a little bit with the distinction between raw feeling, which I'm saying is what's contributed by the brainstem, and its modulation of message passing in the cortex and other forebrain, and indeed other structures altogether. Raw feeling just tells you here and now how well or badly things are going in terms of your attempts to minimize your free energy across different categories of free energy, qualitatively distinctive categories of free energy. But what cortex enables us to do is it provides this temporal depth, this ability to be able to compare, if I were to do that, what would happen, as opposed to if I were to do that, what would happen, and so on. And I think this is the contribution, not to put too fine a point on it, this is the contribution of cortex, this is the contribution of cognition. Rendering it conscious enables us to feel our way through these problems in a counterfactual way. And that's an enormous additional adaptive advantage. I'm not saying that the cortex does nothing of interest. I'm very grateful for having a cortex, and I have no desire to give it up. But that's not the foundation of the story. The elementary form of consciousness is just raw feeling. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. That was really fun. I had a question about this particular slide. Earlier, it sounded like to me like you were saying that kind of affect comes first and consciousness comes later. In this diagram, precision, which I understand is sort of affect or correlative affect or something like that, sits outside of the sensory states. And so I'm wondering, is the implication here that you can have affect without being conscious?
Okay, let me, you see what you've just said, with no disrespect to you, it conveys the prejudice that our field has had for as long as we've been thinking about this sort of thing in our field. You're saying there's a distinction between affect, this thing I'm talking about, and consciousness. And I'm saying, no, no, no. Affect is the foundational elemental form of consciousness. If I can put it this way, first, and I'm putting it into words, this obviously it's not verbalized, but I'm trying to translate into words, the basic mechanism. It is, first of all, I feel like this. And then secondly, I feel like this about that. So it's affect applied to representations of the sensory motor world. But let me, just to make it a little clearer, because for brevity, I've obviously just given the headlines of everything in this talk. The way that I think it works is that all of these individuals, we have multiple needs. And let me reiterate, not all needs are felt. So some are dealt with entirely autonomically. But all of our homeostatic systems, all of them send their residual error signal to the periaqueductal gray. So the periaqueductal gray is where all of these residual needs, after an action perception cycle is completed, the remaining error is delivered to periaqueductal gray. I think the main function of periaqueductal gray, and again, I'm localizing it to one structure. It's not the only structure that functions like this, but it's by far the main structure. And I say again, it is the destination of all homeostatic residual error signals. The function of the periaqueductal gray is to prioritize. Because we can't do everything at once, and we have multiple homeostats, and so we have many things that are out of kilter simultaneously. It's no accident that the periaqueductal gray is immediately adjacent to the superior colliculi. So in the superior colliculi, you have a sort of condensed, concentrated, what's been called a salience map, a sort of a map of current opportunities reduced to their absolute action basics. And there, the periaqueductal gray has this representation, for want of a better word, of current needs. So you have needs and opportunities, and it's on this basis that a prioritization is performed. That depends on precision values, a modulation of precision values. And I think that the selecting of a particular need, in other words, a particular need now is the one that's prioritized, that is how it becomes felt. So all the other needs are there, but the prioritization of a need is announcing to the organism, for the organism, I am thirsty, or my blood gas balance is out of kilter, I need oxygen. And it doesn't come in the form of words, it comes in the form of suffocation alarm. All the other needs are still there, but they are now rendered automatic. The response to those needs continues automatically, while the one where the greatest need to reduce uncertainty resides is the one that's prioritized. This is the problem that you now have to feel your way through. Then the reticular activating system, which sets precision values, now palpates the precision in the incoming error signals, which is of course directly proportionate to the precision in the outgoing predictions, and in this way adjusts its actions and policies on the basis of how well or badly things are going. Remember, always the product of the action is delivered back to periaqueductal gray. I think this is the way that it works. The automatized actions are where they are fixed precisions. So the voluntary actions are the ones in which you are changing your mind, you are palpating your precisions and changing your policies accordingly. That's the way that it works. Now, to come back to your terminological, if I may say so, error at the beginning, you see there how the feeling actually underwrites all of the cognitive and perceptual consciousness. You feel your way into your perceptions and cognitions, which otherwise carry on unconsciously.
Right, and so maybe I'm misapplying something else that you said, which is that it doesn't mean anything to feel something if you don't feel it. Like, you know, happiness isn't a thing unless you feel happy. But at least intuitively to me, if I feel happy, it's equivalent to an observation I'm making. That there's some observation I'm making of my affective state. That's information that I'm taking into my model, and I'm using that to update. But what I'm saying is that here, precision, which I understand as affect, sits outside of sensory states. I.e., I don't, unless I misunderstand, I actually don't in this model observe my affect. And so is that correct? Or are you saying that the affect sits unconscious, I don't observe it, but the outputs of that I do observe?
It's absolutely correct. And so I don't want to become overly pedantic, but let me, because I'm speaking at a meeting at which Anil Seth spoke earlier, let me make clear that here, I differ from Anil and Lisa Feldman-Barrett for that matter. They think, each in their own different ways, that affect just is perception. In Anil's case, it just is interoception and as opposed to exteroception. So exteroceptive visual, auditory, somatosensory, and whatnot signals are exteroceptive perceptions, and perceptions of your interoceptive state are affects. That's just not true. There are many interoceptive states, like a gurgling tummy or just being aware of yourself inhaling and exhaling and whatnot. There's no affect attached to it. It is perception. That is perception. And likewise, there are many affective states which are not interoceptive. You get a fright because of something that happens outside of you. You feel pain because of a pin that's stuck into your finger from the outside. You miss your brother out there. And there's nothing interoceptive about them. So what these are deviations from homeostatic preferred states. And that's the affect. The Lisa Feldman-Barrett's view is slightly different, not that different from Anil's, but again, she thinks that affects are just perceptions. The way that she sees it is that you perceive, you make inferences about your affective state, just like you make inferences about anything else in the world. If we go back to the way that you just described it, I would say this, that yes, you're right. I do not think that affects are perceptions. I think affects are states of the subject, but then you can think about your state and you can perceive it and you can cognize it. Of course, that happens in parallel and for very good reasons. That adds further adaptive advantages. But I don't think that affects are perceptions. They do sit outside of the perception action cycle.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. That was a lovely talk and very compelling. You expressed early in the talk your incredulity at your colleagues' resistance to understanding that the acortical infants were having experience, and their response that, well, they could be philosophical zombies.
Yep.
And I would just say that those very same colleagues, I believe, are people who would look at you or me and say that we could be philosophical zombies.
Indeed.
So my question to you is, why do people think that way? I'm incredulous that anyone believes in philosophical zombies. So do you have any insight about why people bring themselves to think this way?
Yeah. Well, let me say, first of all, that a lot rides on that. A lot rides on it clinically, a lot rides on it ethically. I think that if we were to start with the philosophical, skeptical position that these kids might be philosophical zombies, we'll treat them medically very differently from how we will treat them if we grant them the alternative hypothesis that probably there is something it is like to be these kids. And that's not a hypothetical statement. I mean, we, until the 1990s, treated these kids as vegetative, and that became a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was really quite terrible. So it's not just a philosophical question. I mean, with no disrespect to philosophers, I think that this issue really has immediate, concrete, and significant implications for what we do as clinicians. But the standard, I'm now trying to address your question. The standard argument that's put is that without reportability, we have no empirical criterion for determining whether an agent is in a conscious state or not. Because consciousness is a subjective state by definition, unless the subject says, I am feeling something now, you cannot empirically know whether they're feeling something or not. And so that is the gold standard now. I see the puzzlement on your face. I share it, really. I mean, although that's my field, I think it's a ridiculous notion, but that is the criterion that's used.
So if I can just interject, there must be a very tight pre-emphasis or preference for linguistic reporting, because otherwise what you're showing on that slide is obviously a report.
Yeah.
So why isn't what's shown on that slide viewed as reporting in exactly the same way that a verbal report is viewed as reporting? Yeah. This is what I really don't understand.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I think an emotional sound, or like that. That's a report of what state you're in. And it's no less or more reliable than a verbal report. They do prioritize verbal reports. And I think that is, as I said a moment ago, it's absurd. It's very easy to write a program to get a chatbot to say, I am feeling something. In other words, to report something. It means nothing. A report is a behavior just like any other behavior. It doesn't have any privileged status at all. So that is the main argument. The main argument is they cannot tell us what they're feeling, and therefore we don't know what they're feeling, and therefore we must adopt this skeptical position. That is the main argument. I'm not saying it's a good one. You're asking me what is the argument. That's the argument. The other argument is, well, there's so much evidence that the cortex is involved in conscious states. You remove the occipital cortex, you go blind. You remove somatosensory cortex, you're anesthetic on that side of the body, and so on. And so this is a kind of I think either a misunderstanding or a willful misunderstanding of what I'm saying. I'm not saying the cortex makes no contribution. I'm saying that you remove all of that cortex and you remove all of those aspects of consciousness, but there is still a sentient being there. It still feels like something to be that being, and it doesn't apply the other way around. That's why I prioritize the affects. The evidence that the way in which we gradually built up it starts with common sense, actually. It starts with British empiricist philosophers, that clearly the mind is constituted by experience. It flows in with sensory experience. And that coincides with our everyday experience. So what am I conscious of? I'm conscious of all of the stuff that I'm seeing and hearing right here and now. So it starts from that. And there's very good evidence that that type of consciousness is cortical. So I think it's a kind of a theoretical inertia by dint of the historical development of our understanding of consciousness. And I think it's a tragedy, because had we started with raw feeling, I don't think the heart problem would ever have arisen in the first place. It's like there's nothing to be puzzled about. Thanks, Chris.
Really great talk, and it raised a number of questions for me, which we may or may not have time to cover, so maybe afterward at some point. I did want to say as a quick comment that in many interesting ways, what you're speaking about really resonates very strongly with the Abhidharma approach to consciousness that we find in the Buddhist traditions. So just wanted to say that might be a source of kind of different ways of thinking about what you're trying to point to. So a very quick clarification, and then maybe a larger question if that's possible. So the clarification for me is, you say that affect on your account is not involving perception, right? But you do mean that it is presented. In other words, the phenomenality of affect is something that's being presented to, let's just call it the agent or the subject. Is that correct?
Yes. Let me just say, first of all, what you said about the Buddhist tradition, it's been said to me before, and that's very interesting. And I think that it's important to, let me restate it. What I'm saying is that consciousness, first and foremost, consciousness is just a subjective state. It does not concern what I call mental solids. So the mental solids arise from an application of the raw feeling to the perception, the perceptual world, and not just to the perceptual world, also to a stabilized representation of the perceptual world. The cortex specializes in that, generating mental solids that we can then do mental work with. We can think our way. It's a very important thing. So yes, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that consciousness is that the sentient subject is literally constituted by affect. And then, as I said earlier, it's a matter of I feel like this about that. So that's affect applied to a stabilized perceptual representation.
So it would be fair to say that there's an awareness, so to speak, of the affect, even though that implies that it's an object. You don't really mean that, but there's a presenting.
The affect is a subject. First, you have to have a subject before you can have consciousness of objects.
Right.
And that's another thing that I think is like so obvious, but the way that we've approached our study of consciousness via consciousness of objects. And I think that therefore we've approached it via a derivative secondary form.
and that's another overlap, incredible overlap with a later Buddhist account. So really amazing. But so I'm just clarifying. So there's a kind of intransitive presenting of the affect.
Yes.
Without a subject-object intentionality involved, right? So I'm wondering one question. So many questions this raises for me. I've collaborated with Lisa, by the way, and I think you may actually be closer than you realize to her position. But in any case, one question would be then: is there a continuity between that kind of phenomenality and the kind of phenomenality that somebody with a cortex has?
Well,
or is
I
that,
think,
or is the cortex just going to make, by putting in subject-object intentionality and so on, is just going to make it a completely different kind of phenomenality?
I think it masks all else from view. Yes, but I think that nevertheless, fundamentally, what drives our action perception cycle is feeling, and I think that recognizing that, sort of uncovering that has important implications for what we think of about what cognition is actually for, how it works.
Kevin, please, and then Richard.
Thanks. Mark, I love that. Just fantastic overview. And I had loads of questions, which you've already sort of answered there. I think the idea of the parallel, the cortex doing the processing to ground the, for the organism, a sense of what this feeling is about. And there having to be some, it's interesting to think there has to be some inference there that goes on, and actually you can be mistaken about it. And I often think sometimes I'll find myself angry, irritated by something. There's something in the environment that's irritating me. And then I think about it for a bit and I realize, shit, I just need coffee. Actually, I'm not actually irritated about that. I've misattributed the thing that's bothering me, which I think is interesting. But just a broad comment that I think you're right that the hard problem is misframed if you think we've got all this conscious, all this sensory processing, so on, and then we add qualities to it. How does that happen? As opposed to thinking, no, we from an evolutionary sense, we just started with the qualitative stuff, and then we add sensory detail to it and mapping of the world and so on. And it relates very much to, I think, the grounding problem of representations, where some people think, how does the meaning get into these representations? How do you add that? And you have the same solution to it. An evolutionary thing says they start grounded. They start with these pragmatic couplings with the environment, and then they get sort of decoupled and dissociated and more abstract. So I think there's a beautiful sort of symmetry there. And the final thing I'll say is just that thinking about these signals of how am I doing, you may be aware of work, say, by Thomas Hills and so on, looking at things like dopamine and C. elegans, the really basic organisms. They give this immediate signal, how am I doing right now? But over evolution, they can be co-opted to become anticipatory signals. What will it feel like if I do that? And then, of course, learning signals. And I think that whole thing, I'm not telling you anything you don't know, just becomes a really beautifully coherent story and way of thinking about things.
I agree, not surprisingly, I agree with every word. I know we're out of time, Mike. I just want to go back to your first statement, because I think there's an important distinction there that there's an increasingly fashionable view about the user illusion, illusionism, and all of this sort of thing in cognitive science. And I think that it's certainly possible to speak of user interfaces and illusions and so on about the nature of reality. In fact, I'm very sympathetic with that view. It's all subjectively constructed in a manner of speaking. But you can't be under an illusion about what you feel. If you feel depressed, you just are depressed. You can't say to a depressed person, you're not really depressed. It's a misrepresentation of what you are. So no, I'm feeling pain, or no, I'm feeling sad. It may be that the causes do not justify the consequences, but it's incoherent to speak of a feeling which is illusory. Feelings just are what they are.
You'd be wrong about what's causing that.
Yes, that's the attribution error that you were speaking of earlier.
Cool. Richard, you're next.
Thank you very much. Mark, I really enjoy that, and it's made me think about things a lot. I find your evidence, your 4 pieces of evidence that affect is generated in those particular deep structures very compelling. And it makes a lot of sense to me that affect is the substance of consciousness and that the cortex is adding what is that affect about. That makes sense to me too. It also makes sense to me that there's a huge natural selection advantage to having homeostatic feedbacks, and that the things that feel good are the things that are actually good. That's why they feel good. But there's a step in there that seemed like a little leap, which I wondered if you could speak to, which is that why couldn't natural selection equally favor homeostatic feedbacks without affect-free homeostatic feedbacks? So it makes sense that if you do have a feeling, it's about the homeostatic feedback, but why couldn't you have a homeostatic feedback without it?
Well, I have two, thanks, Richard. I have two answers to that. The first is that, in fact, we do have homeostatic feedback without feeling. For example, blood pressure regulation goes on. I mean, it's a clinically notorious example that you only know about undershoots or overshoots in terms of the viable bounds of your blood pressure when it's too late. So homeostasis does not require feeling. This is why I'm saying it's an extended form of homeostasis, and I articulated what those extended forms, what the additional functionality that comes with feeling, what that is. I won't repeat that. I know that you did understand all of that. Your question, I think, this is the second part of my answer to it, points more to this question: could the same functionality not be achieved in some other way? In other words, is this the only way for us to be able to register different categories of homeostatic deviation subjectively, et cetera, et cetera? Now, I've already said that given the mechanism that we have, if you describe it, this is the crux of my argument. If you describe it mechanistically, you just have described, you have explained feeling. So that just is a feeling that if you, this is why I'm trying to engineer it. You know, if that is how you produce a feeling, then, you know, it's not surprising that it will end up being felt. You know, it's the organism subjectively registering its own state in terms of a qualitative to distinctive modality that matters to it in terms of its very, you know, existence. But I grant you that it's not the only way it could be done. But we mustn't set a higher bar for feeling or for consciousness than for anything else in nature. You know, ambulation, legs work great. You know, this is why they were selected. But you can ambulate with fins. You know, it doesn't work as well if you're a land animal. But, you know, land animals don't all have legs. It's just, you know, it so happens that feeling is what evolved and it works like a bomb. And so it's retained, it's conserved. But it's not, I think it's conceivable that the same thing could be achieved some other way. Certainly it's conceivable.
Your implication is that if it was achieved some other way, it wouldn't be as good, but it doesn't seem that the feeling it adds anything to it.
No, I don't agree that feeling it doesn't add anything to it. Look at your own life, Richard.
Well, I don't agree either, but I didn't see how that connection was made.
Sorry, what was that last comment?
I don't agree either, but I don't see how that connection is made, right? I know that the feeling matters to me, but I don't see how, I don't see what the argument is that it's better that it's connected that way.
Sorry, I'm not saying it's better. I'm saying it works. This is how it evolved. It works, so it's conserved. It might have evolved differently had that also worked, and presumably it has evolved differently in other. I'm not sure that all creatures are sentient. I'm not sure that all organisms are sentient. We're getting into, you know, sort of very speculative territory there. I think that I reiterate what I said a moment ago, that we mustn't set a higher bar for consciousness than for anything else in nature. We can directly observe that consciousness exists. It is part of nature. We need to explain it. We don't need to do anything spooky. We must explain it in the same way as we explain anything else. And I think that I've shown that we can do that. It's the ordinary rules of science, you know, that it seems that this is how it works. So then let me make testable predictions from that hypothesis. I test them. And so far, you know, every test of those predictions leads to a confirmation. And on that basis, we retain the hypothesis. This is, you know, the same. It's like, why must the universe have started with a big bang? It might have started some other way. Well, in fact, it might have started some other way. It could have started some other way. We're not sure that the way that we think it started is correct. But, you know, so far, all the evidence points to that conclusion. I think that the kinds of arguments, the conceivability argument and so on, the kinds of arguments that you're alluding to, I think that those arguments only arose in the first place because we started in the wrong place. All of the puzzlement about consciousness only arose, I think, because we were studying derivative forms of it, and it seemed very odd. What was said earlier in the Q&A, about the dawn of consciousness, a creature just feeling that it is too hot or feeling that it is low on energy supplies, if that's how it all began, I think there's nothing puzzling or unexpected about it. The other thing that's very important in all of this, and perhaps especially at a meeting like the one that we're at now, is that the taking of the viewpoint of the organism is an absolutely necessary part of science, especially of mental science. If we're not allowed to not allowed to ask, what is it like, or is it like anything from the point of view of the system that I'm studying? If we rule out that observational perspective, then we've ruled mental life out of natural science.
Great,
Thank you.
thanks. Lisa, please. Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for this. This was really, really cool. I do completely buy into the idea that affect comes first, and I understand how, okay, so the organism feels a thing, decides to do a thing, or decides not to do a thing, goes towards things, goes away from things, and then there's the idea that the brainstem mechanisms then get upgraded by neocortex, and then more symbolic things you care about, right? So suddenly it's no longer just about whether or not you like something, but it's also, does it fit your values? Does it fit your worldview? Does something, I don't know, if you read something on the news about faraway places, do you care, right? Suddenly it's something about bigger things. And so I guess I have two questions. One is, if you could speak about neural mechanisms of, so do those neocortical, let's say, higher order aesthetic, affective conditions of our symbolic life, do they also then condition the kind of a faster brainstem response to stimuli? I guess that's one question. Or do you just need this kind of, I guess maybe slower, but we still feel it as a fast response through the interaction between neocortex and brainstem? And the second, I guess, is a little bit larger, but this is what I care about a lot. So it's one thing if you're interacting with things in the world and you're reacting to things and you're modulating yourself, you're doing your affective homeostasis, but it's another thing, why do we need a lot of the virtual affective acrobatics? Like in dreams, like watching movies, right? Like, why do we need to read a novel and weep? Why do we tell each other funny stories, right? Why do we kind of seek out this affect, but in the virtual spaces of, well, culture but also subjective life, mental life, just spontaneously? Thank you.
Thanks. I think, let me start at the end of your question and then move back to the beginning. I think the question that you've asked there about affect applies also to mental solids. It applies also to perception and cognition. The thinking, in fact, is just virtual acting. The question you're asking is not specifically about affect. But I want to mention that we have learned something about the basic kinds of emotion. And I'm not speaking now about bodily affects. There are bodily affects which I emphasized in my talk because they're the most basic ones and also the easiest to explain. But we also have emotional homeostats. Fear is an outstanding example. And my viable bounds are not to be in danger. If I find myself to be in danger, I feel fear. My viable bounds, if I'm a mammal, are to be close to my caregiving object. If I become separated from my caregiving object, I feel separation distress. And these basic emotions, which I'm referring to, which have also been given a very bad press by Lisa Feldman-Barrett. Oh, let me just say, I forgot to say, you said my views are not as far from hers as they might appear to be. I've had two 1.5 hour long debates with her, which are publicly available on YouTube. That's what I try to persuade her of, but she's having none of it. She does not believe that there are such things as natural kinds of affect and natural kinds of emotion, which I find very hard to get my head around. But back to my story, there are basic kinds of emotion. There's lots and lots of evidence for that. And they include things which are rather unexpected, like, for example, play. Mammals, at least all mammals, need to play. And so a lot of the virtual and symbolic sort of feeling that you're referring to is bound up with that. And it's very interesting and very important for us to understand, why we do what we do, and being able to understand the underlying structure of much of what we do. Likewise, seeking, what's called seeking, a sort of an epistemophilic drive. It's a very basic emotional need to engage with uncertainty, to try to explain what currently is inexplicable. And a lot of our philosophical and aesthetic pursuits, in fact, are not as far removed from our basic phenotypic needs as we might imagine. But coming to your first question, yes, absolutely. It's not just a bottom-up mechanism. There are, of course, top-down controls too, and this adds important functionality. It's not just a matter of feeling our way into our cognitions. It's also a way of cognitively regulating our feelings. And all of this, let me remind you, comes down ultimately to the mechanics of precision. That there's a point at which the precision in an error signal, a bottom-up error signal, is going to be so strong as to override any amount of cognitive decisions, which otherwise would be able to override more primitive response patterns. It certainly is not just a bottom-up account that I'm giving. I want to add one thing. I see we've gone on for longer than I expected, so I'm sorry if my earlier answers were more clipped than they needed to be. So if we do have a couple of minutes more, but given the nature of this meeting, I want to just add a little footnote to what you were saying. Because you were saying, okay, so the brainstem mechanisms this and the cortical mechanisms that, and that's fine. What you're saying is mimicking the language we all use and the language that I used in this talk. But I want to say, because of the meeting that we're at, that I want to at least make plain that I do not think that these neural mechanisms produce the feelings or the experiences like the liver produces bile. I think that we have two different observational perspectives on the mental instrument. The one is the external one, where we see tissues and we can do anatomical and physiological and whatnot studies on this object called the brain or the nervous system or the body as a whole. Then there is the being of that creature, which is another observational perspective upon the same part of nature. The feelings just are the subjective perspective upon being that organism. Their feelings are not produced by it's like saying, how does the visual image of lightning produce the auditory sound of thunder? These are just two different ways of representing the same thing. And so why that's interesting is that the same thing, what is that thing? Again, what we're left with is just inferences about the essential, and the language of mathematics, as Galileo said, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. I think that this kind of, these formalisms, these kinds of models that people like Carl and Chris and Mike are working with, I think that these are the causal mechanisms of the scientific observables. Those are the mechanisms that produce these phenomena. The one perspective upon the phenomena doesn't produce the other perspective upon the phenomena. And what's interesting is the question as to what kind of formal organizations in nature does it feel like something to be? And why? And does it feel like something to be everything in nature, or only some things bestowed with the observational perspective of being themselves? And what does that add, and what does it subtract, and so on? I think those are very, very interesting questions.
Cool. Two last questions, please.
Yeah, and we can pick this up offline if there's a not enough time. So this is a Buddhist-y question. So in the Soto Zen tradition, I think there's a way of describing both the kind of the goal and the outcome as a smoothing of affect. I mean, I think that's a way you could describe it, in the sense of not being less aware of affect, but rather having less preference for specific affects. And the practice is largely objectless meditation. And so I wonder whether you have a view on the mechanism by which the less preference for states, a smoothing of affect might come about through that practice.
Well, let me begin by once again confessing my ignorance, as I did when I introduced myself yesterday. I mean, I really know embarrassingly little about Buddhism and Eastern traditions generally, and that's not a good thing to admit to. So it's a confession. I'm sorry. I really know very little. From the little bit that I do know, I will say these two things. The one is that I think that these meditative practices, to the extent that I know anything about them, we must recognize that they are skills. These are abilities that one learns, one acquires, a bit like being psychoanalyzed. It enables you to be able to get a grip on your feelings in a way that makes things go better for you. That, the way that you have evolved, by which I mean developed, the way you've developed over your ontogenetic lifetime, how I'm going to deal with my needs is not necessarily the best way. And I think we have many false beliefs about what we need, what will make us happy, and we all get ourselves into a terrible shambles. And from what I've understood about Buddhism, it's a great sort of wisdom acquired through learning and through generations of experience about how not to get lost and how to come back to fundamentals. But I emphasize again, it's a skill. It's not something that we just have. It's something that you really, it's in a sense, artificial in that sense. It's not the way that the mental instrument normally works. It's an acquired capacity to be able to not be so subject to these forces as we otherwise would be. And that's a good thing, to be able to gain some sort of agency, some sort of ownership, and some sort of transcendence of through wisdom and understanding, some sort of rising above being buffeted by all of these things. But the second and last thing I wanted to say is that still it doesn't exempt you from, I mean, even the Buddha presumably had to breathe, and so it doesn't exempt you from the basics of homeostasis. It just enables you to not be so buffeted and so misled by its powers.
Maybe one very quick follow-up question. And in terms of the sort of the mechanism, do you think of being less buffeted as being less attribution error or less sort of?
Well, from, again, the very little I understand, it seems that there are different types of...
Or maybe I can ask you, though, I mean, forget about the Buddhism bit. If someone were to be less buffeted by affect, how would you view the mechanism for that?
Well, let me link it to what you're saying to what Elizabeth said earlier about symbolization of affects and so on. That, one comes to believe, if only I could have lots and lots of money in the bank, then I'll be happy. And so all I'm going to do in my life is I'm going to accumulate wealth and disregard everything else. That's a mistake, because in fact, it's not your only need to accumulate wealth. You have many other needs as well, and they conflict with each other, and you're living a highly unbalanced life in terms of meeting all your needs if that's all you do. And what is more, you don't really need wealth. In fact, the need that lies behind that has something to do with one of these basic emotional things, which in that case actually has to do with play. In other words, your position within the group, which is important to mammals because they're social species and so on. So I think just like, and I'm sorry to keep on referring back to psychoanalysis, because that's a tradition that I do know. Just like in psychoanalysis, you can get you can undo all of these self-deceptions and all of these false paths that one goes down with the fond illusion that this is really what you need, and you get back to basics and a much more fundamental understanding of what it's really about. And the more you understand how things really work, the more you're able to influence them and be less subject to them. It's the way I would put it. I'm sorry if I sound like an amateur, it's because I am one.
Thank you. That's great.
Okay, Bo.
Mark, thank you for the wonderful talk. I have a question about homeostasis. Maybe it's too basic a question, but when I hear that word, I think of somewhat being sort of about survival, about somewhat selfish genes, survival of the fittest. And well, a lot of times in this particular setting, in the past few days, hear about, Richard's work and Mike's work or Thomas's work about like caring and sort of cooperation and about the larger whole, right? And maybe just I have too narrow a definition of homeostasis, right? But I want to bring this point. I want to sort of ask your comment about it because I could see that if we start believe that this work could be sort of misinterpreted to say, oh, if the basis of consciousness is about survival, that's how we initially got that sort of the affect for survival, then of course it adds to the current discourse and the current kind of direction of sort of reductionist kind of survivalist kind of a strategy that underlies our society today. So I wanted to see whether you have any comments about that.
Yeah. I seem to, my response to every question I think this morning has been, well, I have two things to say about that. I don't know why that's the case. I have two things to say about what you've just said. The one is that, and I was saying this last night at supper, I think, and I said it in response to Richard's talk, which he had just spoken before supper. I think that introducing subjectivity, introducing experience, introducing the point of view of being these things that we're studying into natural science, although that's not in itself a non-reductive or an anti-reductive step, I think it's a very important step. I think that the many of the evils of reductionism, of eliminative reductionism that Richard was talking about yesterday, I think that they can be dealt with just by taking that step. And so just by bearing in mind that we're not only talking about things, we're talking about beings. And I think that the whole attitude and the whole explanatory framework that you would have to use would change. And please note, that's not, it's not speaking about reductionism. It's speaking about, a purely materialist approach. As opposed to my approach, which is a dual aspect monist approach. I'm not a materialist, I'm a dual aspect monist. And the question then becomes, well, then what is the monist essence? What is that made of? And that's what I was footnoting, adding on to my answer to Elizabeth, trying to squeeze that in. However, this is the second part of my answer to your question. It's not a matter, I think that just looking at the mechanism of homeostasis, bearing in mind what I've just said, it includes its extended form, its felt form, which is a very important extension. But just looking at the mechanism of homeostasis, I don't think it implies, I don't think that it carries along with it any of this sort of stuff about selfish genes and Dawkins and an entirely bottom-up approach, etc. It's not homeostasis is. It's not wedded to any of those attitudes. And I will link that to what I was saying a minute ago about what we've learned about emotional needs as opposed to bodily needs. There are lots of interesting surprises there. So we have needs like I was speaking of fear and rage, which has to do with the need to not be impeded, to not have frustrating obstacles preventing you from getting what other things you need. There are these ones which sound, nasty, fear and rage, given what we heard yesterday from our guest, the monk, about lust. Perhaps I could add that too. I'm not so sure about that, but there are emotional needs of, like I was just saying, play, which is a need to cooperate, a need to be able to negotiate between my needs and your needs. This is a phenotypic need of mammals. It's not an antisocial, nasty thing. There's a nurturant need. We need to care for vulnerable, dependent little ones. That's as much a biological need as is fear or rage or lust. So as we understand these things, So we learn that homeostatic, phenotypically given emotional needs are some of them are pro-social, some of them are rather nice to know that we have them and important to know that we have them, so that we can, like I was saying in response to the question about how we can mislead ourselves and go down wrong paths, one can lead a more balanced life. Even looking at it homeostatically, if you understand better what these homeostats are for. But let me end by saying we must remember that natural selection doesn't operate at the level of the individual. It operates at the level, you could say of the species. You could even say it operates at the level of all living things. That ultimately we all have to share, this environment with each other. And if we don't take account of that, it ultimately ends badly for all of us. So a biological perspective is not necessarily a kind of nasty, materialist, selfish, genetic perspective. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thanks.